pork and lonka claws for the men, cooked in a savory broth. The women dined elsewhere, including, supposedly, Toe's sister. Dalinar hadn't met her yet. The Western Light Ice had arrived barely an hour before the storm hit. The hall was soon clogged with the sounds of people eating and chatting. Dalinar tore into his lonka claws, cracking them with the bottom of his mug and biting out the meat. This feast seemed too polite. Where was the music, the laughter, the women, eating in separate rooms? Life had been different these last few years of conquest. More and more of Gavilar's time was required by the administration of his kingdom, which was half as big as they wanted it to be, but still demanding. Politics. Gavilar and Sadeas didn't make Dalinar play at it too often, but he still had to sit at feasts like this one, rather than dining with his men. He sucked on a claw, watching Gavilar talk to the foreigner. Storms. Gavilar actually looked regal with his beard combed like that, glowing gemstones on his fingers. He wore a uniform of the newer style, formal and rigid. Dalinar instead wore his skirt-like takama and an open overshirt that exposed his chest. Sadeas held court with a group of lesser Light Eyes at a table across the hall. Everyone of that group had been chosen carefully as men with uncertain loyalties. Sadeas would talk, persuade, convince, and listen for signs of rebellion. Dalinar finished the claws, then turned toward his pork, a succulent slab of meat swimming in gravy. The food was better at this feast. He just wished he didn't feel so useless here. Gavilar made alliances. Sadeas dealt with problems. Those two could treat a feast hall like a battlefield. Dalinar shook his head, reaching to his side for his knife so he could cut his pork. Only the knife wasn't there. Damnation! He'd loaned it to Talib, hadn't he? He stared down at the pork, smelling its peppery sauce, and found his mouth watering. He reached to eat with his fingers, then thought to look up. Everyone else was eating primly, with utensils, but the servers had forgotten to bring him a knife. Damnation again. He sat back, wagging his mug for more wine. Nearby, Gavilar and that foreigner continued their chat. Your campaign here has been impressive, Bright Lord Colin, Toe said. One sees a glimmer of your ancestor in you, the great Sunmaker himself. Hopefully, Gavilar noted, my accomplishments won't be as ephemeral as his. Ephemeral? He reforged Alethkar, Bright Lord. Yet his empire didn't even last a single generation past his death. What kind of legacy is that? The storm rumbled. Dalinar tried to catch a servant to request a dinner knife, but they were too busy, scuttling about, seeing to the needs of demanding feastgoers. He sighed, then stood, stretching, and walked to the door, holding his empty mug. Lost in thought, he threw aside the bar on the door, then shoved open the large wooden construction and stepped outside. A sheet of icy rain suddenly washed over his skin, and wind blasted him, strong enough that he stumbled. The high storm was at its height, lightning smashing down like vengeful attacks from the heralds themselves. Dalinar struck out into the storm, his overshirt whipping around him. Gavilar talked more and more about things like legacy, the kingdom, responsibility. What had happened to the fun of the fight, of riding into battle laughing? Thunder clashed, and the periodic slices of lightning were barely enough to see by. Still, Dalinar knew his way around well enough. This was a high-storm way stop, a place built to house patrolling armies during storms. Gavilar and he had been positioned at this one for a good 4 months now, drawing tribute from nearby farms and menacing House Evankaw from just inside its borders. Dalinar selected one bunker in particular and pounded on the door. No response. So he summoned his shard blade, slid the tip through the crack, and sliced the bar inside. He pushed open the door to find a large group of armed men with wide, terrified eyes, standing in a line, weapons held in nervous grips. Talib, Dalinar said, standing in the doorway. Did I loan you my belt knife? My favorite one, with the white spine ivory on the grip. The tall soldier, who stood in the second rank of terrified men, gaped at him. Your knife, Bright Lord? I lost the storming thing somewhere, Dalinar said. I loaned it to you, didn't I? I gave it back, sir, Talib said. You used it to pry that splinter out of your saddle, remember? Damnation, you're right. What did I do with that blasted thing? Dalinar shook his head, leaving the doorway and striding back into the storm. Perhaps the reason that he was so worried about Gavilar had more to do with himself than it did his brother. 4 years at war, and they'd already secured half the kingdom. Their progress was remarkable, yet these last months had been more about what happened off the battlefield than on it. Even their battles were so calculated these days. It all seemed to be leaving Dalinar behind like the discarded shell of a Kremling after its molting. An explosive burst of wind drove him against the wall, and he stumbled, then stepped backward, driven by instincts he couldn't define. A large boulder slammed into the wall, then bounced free. Dalinar looked out and saw something glowing in the distance, a gargantuan figure that moved on spindly, luminous legs. Dalinar stepped back up to the door to the feast hall, gave the whatever it was a rude gesture, then pushed open the door, throwing down 2 servants who had been holding it closed. He strode back in, streaming with water, and hiked back up to the high table where he flopped down, still holding his mug. Wonderful. Now he was wet and he still couldn't eat his pork. Everyone had gone silent. A sea of eyes stared at him. "Brother?" Gavilar asked, the only sound in the room. "Is everything all right?" "Lost my storming knife," Dalinar said. "Thought I'd left it in the other bunker." He raised his mug and took a loud, lazy slurp of rainwater. "Excuse me, Lord Gavilar," Toe stammered. "I find myself in need of refreshment." The golden-haired Westerner stood from his place, bowed and retreated. His face seemed even paler than those folk normally were. "What's wrong with him?" Dalinar asked, scooting his chair closer to his brother. "I assume," Gavilar said, sounding amused, "that people he knows don't casually go for strolls in ice storms." "Bah," Dalinar said. "This is a fortified war camp with walls and bunkers. We needn't be scared of a little wind." Toe thinks differently, I assure you. "You're grinning. Well, you may have just proven in one moment a point I've been spending a half an hour trying to make politically. Toe wonders if we're strong enough to protect him." "Ah, is that what the conversation was about?" "Obliquely, yes." "Glad I could help," Dalinar said, sucking on the claw. "What does it take to get one of those fancy servants to bring me a storming knife?" "They're master servants, Dalinar," his brother said, making a sign by raising his hand in a particular way. "The sign of need, remember?" "No." "You really need to pay better attention," Gavilar said. "We aren't living in huts anymore." They'd never lived in huts. They were Kholin. He didn't like that Gavilar was buying into the story that the rest of the kingdom told, the one that claimed his branch of the house had, until recently, been ruffians from the backwaters of their own princedom. A gaggle of servants in black and white flocked to Gavilar, and he requested a new dining knife for Dalinar. As they split to run the errand, the doors to the women's feast hall opened, and a figure slipped in. Dalinar's breath caught. Navani's hair glowed with the tiny ruby she'd woven into it, a color matched by her pendant and bracelet. Her face a sultry tan, her hair jet Alethi black, her red-lipped smile so knowing and clever. And a figure to make a man weep for desire. His brother's wife. Dalinar steeled himself and raised his arm in a gesture kind of like the one Gavilar had made. A serving man stepped up with a springy gait. "Right, Lord," he said. "I see to your desires, of course, though you may wish to know that the sign is off. If you'll allow me to demonstrate..." Dalinar made a rude gesture. "Is this one better?" Wine," Dalinar said, wagging his mug. "Violet. Enough to fill this 3 times at least." "And what vintage would you like, Bright Lord?" He eyed Navani. "Whichever one is closest." Navani slipped between tables, followed by the squatter form of Ela Sadius. Neither seemed to care that they were the only light-eyed women in the room. "What happened to the emissary?" Navani said as she arrived, sliding between Dalinar and Gavilar as a servant brought her a chair. "Dalinar scared him off," Gavilar said. The scent of her perfume was heady. Dalinar scooted his chair to the side and set his face. Firm. Don't let her know how she made him feel warm, made him live like nothing else but the battle.